I'm about to meet Minette Norman, who wrote a book called The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And I am really keen to talk to her because she talks about inclusion in a really refreshing way, in ways that I have not heard so far. I think the words diversity and inclusion and equality have been so overused that they start to lose their meaning. But Minette talks about this really essential topic of inclusion in a way that is bold, it's courageous, and it's groundbreaking. So I'm excited to talk to her. Let's see if she is here to join us.
I'm Minette Norman. I am a speaker and a leadership consultant who focuses on inclusive leadership with a strong foundation of psychological safety. I'm the author of 2 books. I wrote The Boldly Inclusive Leader that came out in August of 2023, and I'm the co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook with Carolyn Helbig, and that came out earlier in February 2023. And I'm happy to be here with you, Ginny.
You've tuned in to Innovators Making a Difference, a podcast series where I meet daring disruptors, tenacious trailblazers, and persistent pioneers who are solving some of the globe's trickiest challenges using science, technology, engineering, and innovation. As Einstein once said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. And here on IMAD, I invite people who are using their intelligence, intuition, and creativity to do things differently. This series will get you questioning your own worldly perspectives, habits, and values. So enjoy. Well, it's great to meet you. And immediately off the bat, congratulations for your book published in August. It's a wonderful title, Boldly Inclusive Leader. I mean, there's just so much to discuss on that. Why did you feel that you needed to write a book like this?
The answer comes from my prior experience, which is I only started doing this work as a consultant a couple of years ago. I spent 30 years before that in the software industry in Silicon Valley, 20 of those years in management and leadership roles. And I realized just how badly prepared most of us are who go into management and leadership to lead inclusive teams of diverse individuals and enable them to truly thrive and do their best work. When I was in the tech industry, even though I did reach a very high level, I ended up as VP of engineering at a large tech company, I often felt marginalized. I often felt like I'm not in the inside group and my voice isn't always welcome. And when I speak, people don't always listen. And I was not alone. There were so many of us who were not able to fully participate to our fullest potential. And I think every leader's job is to bring out the full potential of their workforce. And I decided to write this book because I think most leaders don't know that they have it inside themselves to do this already. And it takes practice, but it's not impossible to become a boldly inclusive leader.
They're such important topics. And actually, you talking about how you felt working in Silicon Valley is almost comforting and reassuring to know that another woman has gone through something similar. Is it cultural? This lack of inclusive or lack of inclusion? Is it a mentality?
I do believe there's a huge part of it that starts with ourselves, our own beliefs, our own mentality. And then, of course, we need to put systems in place to make sure that the bias that is everywhere isn't getting into our workplaces the way it is today. But I truly believe that the inclusive culture starts with every leader's behavior and every way they show up as a leader. And how do they listen to the people around them? How do they reward the people around them? What they tolerate, what they reward, what they listen to, what they ignore. All of this is incumbent upon every leader to pay attention to and to become aware of. Otherwise, they will inadvertently, and I should say actually we will inadvertently exclude some people because of our own innate biases.
This podcast is called Innovators Making a Difference, and
Yes.
your thinking is truly innovative. What would the world look like if it was more inclusive? Let's start with the professional world.
Yeah, the professional. So it's very interesting, and I was interested in your podcast being on innovation because to me, there is a very clear link between inclusion and innovation. Because, as you know, focusing on innovation, as you focus on innovation, you realize that innovations do not come from a single person. They come from a collection of people who think differently, who do not agree on everything. And bringing together those divergent ideas often results in the biggest innovations rather than one person sitting alone. Why this relationship between inclusion and innovation is, to me, so crystal clear is that we cannot tap into that genius, that collective genius of a diverse group of people, unless we create cultures that are psychologically safe and inclusive. And what the world of work would look like to me is that no matter who you are, and I really am speaking about any aspect of human diversity, so not just gender and race, but all the ways that we are different, including thinking differently, no matter who you are and what your identity is, you would be able to go to work knowing that you are appreciated for who you are uniquely. Your voice would be invited and welcomed and respected, and that you could freely share your ideas, even if they disagree with others and even if they diverge from the conforming beliefs. And organizations would be able to, as I say, tap into that collective genius, but really create an environment where people want to work because they feel appreciated, because they feel seen and heard and valued for who they are. That's what inclusion is. And that's what I think really contributes to breakthrough ideas and innovation.
Your suggestions, your ideas are really comforting. It's almost like you provide the solutions to problems that I've dragged around with me for so long. What I mean by that is that when I struggled to use my voice because I'm different, I just accepted that that's just the way things are. And the idea that you're coming along and saying, no, we need to provide an environment where someone who is unconventional or non-conforming or different in some way needs to feel safe in order to contribute. It's like you're leading in your own way. You're giving people like me permission to exist. Why is there such a resistance to something that just feels so necessary and fruitful?
Yes, there is. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that the status quo that you're describing, that you sort of said, I accept that this is the way it is. That's exactly what I'm challenging, because I've seen too many people like you and me and others who put up with it for far too long. So I think we need to completely blow that up and say, this is not how work should be. Why there is so much resistance, I think this is partially because of who we are as human beings. And part of it is that we are wired to connect with people who are like us. This is what's known as our affinity bias. It's built into us as a species. So we're most comfortable with the people that we gravitate towards and we feel like us, right? That this person is like me and this person is maybe different. And we distrust, even if we aren't aware of it, we may distrust or just not connect easily with the people who feel more different. And I think the problem in the workplace and in the world in general, but since we're focusing first on the workplace, is that leaders and managers, first of all, they tend to hire people just like them. We've seen that a lot. Like, why is it that there are so many leadership teams that are completely homogeneous? Well, probably because the most senior leader picked people who they felt comfortable with. And that's why we get boardrooms that look alike and C-staffs that look alike. So we have to actively fight that innate affinity bias and instead get curious to bring in people who are not like us, who may challenge our thinking, to spend time. I mean, this is one of the things I advocate, is spend time and get curious and get to know people who are different from you, That is how we expand our horizons. It's how we create diverse and inclusive workplaces. And it is honestly how we solve the very challenging business problems we have in front of us, because we need that diversity of thought and diversity of experience and diversity of culture and background. That's how our business problems and technology problems and ethical problems will be solved, not by hiring people who are just like us and not by listening to people who are just like us. So I think that's the tension that you're getting to, is that why is this not happening? Because we have to fight that natural bias of just surrounding ourselves and listening to people like us.
Do you ever get frustrated with the giant task you've set yourself?
Yes, and I do. Sometimes it feels so daunting and like you're trying to change everything. And at the same time, here's the deal. I was in tech for 30 years, and someone recently asked me, well, it must have been so different and so much harder to be a woman back in 1989 when you started in the software industry. We've come so far, right? And I said, we've come a little ways in 30 years, but we have not come far enough. I mean, it wasn't that different, except that we didn't talk about these things openly, but really the behaviors were not so different. Things were not so different 30 years ago. And I feel like we cannot wait another 30 years or even 10 years to change these things. So rather than getting frustrated, this is how I'm coping with it. It's like, yes, it's huge. And I also know that small changes done regularly and practiced can make a huge difference. And so what I'm trying to get leaders and their teams to do is like, you don't have to totally throw out all of your systems, but how about starting with your own behavior? Like, how are you listening to people? How are you inviting people to show up to meetings? How are you inviting other voices? And we can put practical tools in place to help you be better at that, right? That's one of the things, is like, it's not the theoretical stuff can be overwhelming, but let's just get down to brass tacks. Like, how do we run our meetings? How do I show up as a leader in every interaction? How can I be more open-minded? And it really does all start with, I think, leadership behavior.
Yeah. I'm actually realizing that your book is even more powerful because it is targeted at the leader. Because as an individual, I've been trying to evolve within myself to fit in, rather than saying, I'm sorry, something has to change here. And you're coming in and saying, I'm going to help make the change happen. And it has to start with leaders, because it's true. Leaders that don't adapt their mentality will just keep perpetuating the problem.
That is exactly right. And it shouldn't fall on the individual contributor who honestly has limited influence. It needs to come. I mean, leaders set the tone, right? Leaders set the tone. People are watching their behavior. People are emulating their behavior. And so it does start with leaders. Of course, everyone plays a role in how everyone else is experiencing work, but leaders have an outsized role to play. And that's why I wrote the book targeting leaders, and not targeting them in a bad way, but trying to help them in a practical way to do better every day, because they can.
But it also explains why innovators and often therefore leaders are people that have been on the outside, essentially, because they've built up those skills of learning to, well, given the resistances they've experienced, it makes them more empathetic towards being on the outside, and therefore giving people a chance, and therefore leading with a more inclusive attitude. So
I think you're right, that anyone who has at any time felt like an outsider has certainly an understanding that people maybe, and this is a lot of leaders, have never been outsiders. They've always been in the insiders club. They've been on that track their whole lives. And so they don't understand, they don't have empathy for people who've been on the outside. And a lot of the time, you're right, the innovators may be the ones who always thought differently, who always were slightly outside the norm, and they have these different ways of seeing the world, and empathy for others may be like them. But yeah, it's not I haven't seen it true that every leader has that natural empathy for the outsider, because some of them have always been on this sort of insider's track. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was in tech, I remember talking to someone at the time who was my peer, and he was a white man who came from like sort of an Ivy League of education. He had been in a fraternity. He had that sort of social support network around him. And then he got into leadership, and he rose very quickly through the ranks. And I remember one day saying that I was really advocating for this formal mentorship program. And he said to me, I don't know why we need a program for that. I've always found mentors whenever I needed them. And I said to him, yes, you have always found mentors, and they're probably people who look like you and have your background. I said, I never had a mentor my whole professional life. Many of the people here, especially women and people from underrepresented groups, have never had a mentor. You said it comes naturally. Why do we need a program? Because the rest of us are not getting mentorship and sponsorship. But it was that moment where, like, he didn't even see that. He saw it. We all see the world through our own lenses. And his lens was, I've always had mentors. Why do I need a formal program for that?
I'm absolutely in agreement with you. In fact, my earlier point was that typically leaders have been a certain type of person.
Yes.
What I'm finding in innovation is that more and more diverse people are shining through. And it's not just in the professional world. I'm seeing more diversity and inclusion in society.
Exactly.
And, because we're seeing more of them, there's this openness to people's differences more than we've ever seen. That's
yes.
the question I'm getting. There may be more resistance as well, more backlash, but I am seeing voices being raised by people that would normally have kept quiet. And as time goes on, I'm seeing more and more of those underrepresented voices become leaders, innovate, and I'm looking for a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, because it's been decades of my own experience where leaders haven't been inclusive, but I'm starting to see a positive change.
I'm so glad that you share that glimmer of hope, because I do too. I don't think I could or would be doing this work if I didn't have hope, because otherwise it would feel futile. But it doesn't. It feels like maybe not every leader out there, but there are enough out there who see that we need to do something different, that we need a different paradigm of leadership. And especially, I was just on a call with a client, and they're talking about the future of work and what the future of work looks like. And this potential new client had come to the conclusion that while we work on the future of work, what we have to start with is a foundation of psychological safety and inclusion. And that made me so happy to hear, because the person I was talking to said, of course, when we talk about future of work, we talk about AI and tools and technologies, but what we're realizing is we need to take a step back and look at the human side of work and what that looks like. So that too gives me huge hope.
Absolutely, especially because so many people are scared that AI will take over.
Exactly.
And for me, I see it as AI won't take over. AI will free us up to be more human.
Exactly.
And so now more than ever, we need to really develop our EQ, because our IQs are advanced. There's no problem there in developing our brains. But in terms of emotional intelligence, we really need to, I don't know, what are your suggestions for developing that more human side?
That's the important thing. And that's really what I write a lot about in the book, is that we start with our own self-awareness. We have to, right? That is EQ, right? Is really like, what is our emotional intelligence? How do we interact? How do we listen? How do we manage our own natural defensiveness when we get challenged, and instead stay curious? I think one of the biggest things about developing our EQ is to realize that we only see the world through this narrow biased lens that we have based on our own experience and culture, and to get curious to learn from others and to see that our way is not the only way. And then we can embrace the full diversity of our workforce, of our planet, of the world. But I think it really does start with coming out of this idea that leaders have to have all the answers, which sort of is the old model of leadership, right? We are the leader of the organization. We are all knowing. We are in command and control of the company or the organization. And instead to say, I am a leader with my strengths and also my weaknesses. And I surround myself with people who can fill in those gaps that I may have. And I can help you bring out your full potential. And that's how we create these workplaces where we can do amazing things together and solve the very gnarly challenges in front of all of us by embracing our full humanity. And that also involves not trying to, so I think this is another thing about emotional intelligence, not trying to shut down our emotions, because too often we think we go to work, especially if we're a leader, we must not be quote unquote emotional. And what I would instead advocate is to say, look, we cannot turn our emotions off when we go to work. We are human. Therefore, let us be very self-aware of our emotions and not let our emotions rule our behavior, but instead get aware, like, okay, I'm getting defensive. I'm frustrated. I don't have to react negatively. I can pause, compose my thoughts, and have a productive response. But if we're not self-aware, then our emotions get the best of us, and we often have very, very negative interactions in the workplace.
Oh, honestly, you are speaking my mind, because so much of it is about self-acceptance. Everything you're talking about is about self-acceptance, but also emotional management.
Yes.
Learn how to manage our emotions. I mean, if we're scared, if we're insecure, it can make us do crazy things, and
Exactly.
So where do we go to learn how to manage our emotions? Is this something that should be taught in schools, for example?
Oh, I think so. And I would hope that there's somewhere that is being taught, because, yeah, I think it's very interesting. If you read Susan David's work, I'm going to forget the name of her book, but we can look this up later. And also Brene Brown, they do a lot of work on naming emotions, right? Like that, saying that we as human beings have a fairly small vocabulary for our emotions. And yet I think in Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, she has like 80 something emotions that she lists. And for us to get better versed, really more knowledgeable about our own emotions, so that, as you said, we can manage our responses. We can't manage our instinctive reactions, but we don't have to respond when we're scared or frustrated in a negative way. We can get in touch with them, recognize them. I actually talk about in my book is like how to take that pause when we're feeling emotionally triggered, so as not to lash out at someone, so as not to belittle someone and embarrass them in public, but instead to pause, take a breath, and then ask a curious and calm follow-up question, so the person continues to feel heard and seen and not embarrassed, and you can engage in dialogue. But none of it is rocket science, but all of it takes practice. And that's where I think that if a leader is open-minded enough to say, like, I'm a work in progress like everybody else, and I'm willing to practice some of these new behaviors and techniques, I will become a better leader for everyone here. And I'm willing to put in that little bit of work. It's not huge work. It's just kind of regular and ongoing work.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could be so daring as to say that not many leaders at the moment actually are emotionally astute or emotionally in tune with themselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. It does. I mean, honestly, I remember when I was leading teams, it was very late in my leadership journey that I sort of got exposed to a lot of these ideas and doing a lot of reading. And I remember the day that I first read about how the fight, flight, freeze response takes us over at work just as much as it does in, trying to keep us alive, and how destructive it is to our interpersonal relationships at work and to our team environments. And I noticed it so much for myself and for others as soon as I started paying attention to it. Like as soon as my awareness was tuned in, I noticed how often I'm getting defensive and how often all of my peers, colleagues, staff members are getting defensive, and how much that gets in the way of productive dialogue and good relationships. And if we can just, pay attention, not have that knee-jerk reaction. And I started to practice that myself. And I started to notice, like, okay, Minette, you're getting defensive, you're getting red. Don't say anything. And take that pause. And then even that just like calming breath freed me up to be able to re-engage in a very different way. And I noticed for myself personally as a leader, what a huge difference that made. And I think it also, like if one person starts to do it and even talks about it, like even if you said like, I'm having a little bit of a reaction right now, I need a moment. What you're doing then is you're showing up as a vulnerable human, right? And you're also giving permission in a way to others to do that same thing. And you're all acknowledging your shared humanity. You can change the tenor of conversations, even just by influencing it in that small way. So I think it's possible, but to your point, I don't think it's very common.
I mean, I am just reeling with delight that we are having a conversation like this when we both have backgrounds in engineering.
Yes.
There was a time in my career where you just didn't talk about these things.
No.
It was kind of soft skills. It was embarrassing. It was awkward. These are topics that you just don't, that they're not seen, they're not heard. It's all behind closed doors. Are we being extremely are we being very maverick to be talking about this within the context of technology, engineering, innovation? Or is there an openness for this kind of dialogue?
So I think we were mavericks a while ago. Like I remember, I think I was a maverick back about 8 or more years ago. I was still in the software business. I was a VP of engineering. I put on a big tech summit. I got to give a keynote every year. And I never gave a keynote about technology. I gave keynotes about collaboration, about empathy, about diversity, about finding purpose at work. And I will never forget, to your question, are we being mavericks? The first one I ever gave was probably around 2015, 2016, something like that. And the night before my talk on collaboration in front of 1,000 engineers, I thought, Minette, what on earth are you doing? You're going to get booed off the stage, essentially. And here's what I found is that even in the geekiest of crowds, the most technical of crowds, the message completely resonated. And people thanked me for doing those talks because honestly, it doesn't matter if you're the chief software architect in a company or the most technical person in the room, you are also a human being with emotions and a heart. And it was often some of the most technical people who said to me, I am so glad that you are bringing up these topics. So this is already going back close to 10 years, or at least 7 or 8 years ago. And what I'm seeing now, certainly with the clients who invite me in, and who are a lot of them in the tech industry, there is an openness. I think there is an acknowledgement that what used to serve us is no longer serving us well. And there is something different we need to do. And honestly, the workforces today, and especially a lot of the younger employees coming in, are no longer tolerating the toxic workplaces or the places where they cannot show up as themselves. And I think some of the ways, and I'm not equating this to age, I'm just saying that the newer employees are just expecting a different kind of workplace, right? And so leaders are realizing they have to do something differently. And I think that, honestly, the pandemic in some ways made us rethink a lot of things, including how we work and how are we inclusive to everyone. And companies are still struggling with it. But I do think there's an opening. So I don't feel like we're being completely unrealistic or maverick. I think there is an opening in many fields. And one last thing before I stop on that is that even in organizations where I would least expect it. So tech, for me, like Silicon Valley is always quite on the cutting edge. And so they've been talking about these topics for a while now. But I was recently invited into a county government in California. And it was up in the foothills of the Sierras. And it was the county government that invited me in for a workshop, a couple of workshops on psychological safety. And the person who discovered my work was the sheriff of the county. So you would not expect a sheriff to be interested in psychological safety. And yet that's where it started. And so even in what seems like sort of the most unexpected places, they are looking for different models of leadership and culture. And that's very encouraging to me.
You know, I listening to you makes me realize that I never gave myself permission to talk about these topics. So everything you talk about is describing what I've wanted to do, what I felt in my heart I need to do, because, you know, it's like in my career, I had a professional persona and I never let my personal persona ever go to work. So I was, you know, I had a mask on for work, you know, I took the mask off when not at work. And so I had all these different kind of personas. The fact that you're talking about just showing up as yourself in the workplace is so, I mean, this is where like the comfort, the reassurance, the relief comes in, because it's like, you know, you don't have to put on an act. And even today, you know, I'm so convinced that the emotional intelligence side of myself is more powerful than my technical side. And it's such an important side of ourselves to develop. And you're confirming that. But the difference between you and me is you've been bold enough to talk about it, whereas I have never talked about it for fear of somehow degrading my technical ability. And I think that this is one of the problems that women face is, you know, women especially, we've got, you know, the feminine side, the motherhood side, you know, all these kind of nurturing, caring roles. And somehow that diminishes the other roles that we can have professionally, technically.
Yes, well, to your point, I mean, first of all, I'm sorry that was your experience, that you felt you had to leave your real identity at the door, and you're not alone. There's so many of us. And I was, as I was saying, it was only late in my career that I was able to come out of that a little bit and be more bold and maybe trailblazing. But women, particularly in tech fields, no matter how technical you are, the bar is higher for you. And it's always like, you know, she's not technical. And that's such a common thing. Like, you know, the woman with the PhD in the room is challenged by the guy who never finished college, kind of thing, right? And it's just that constant having to prove ourselves. So that I completely understand why you did what you did and why you felt you had to do what you did. And even the words you use, the soft skills, I've heard that so much. And the soft skills are denigrated a lot. Like they're not the real skills. We need the real skills. And then those soft skills, like those touchy-feely things. And I don't like the term at all, because I think these are the power skills. These are the skills we need for the world today.
Yeah. I mean, summarized, we just need to allow each other to be human.
That's it. That's pretty much my message.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, it's so powerful. And allowing each other to just be human will allow for more innovation.
It will. Yeah, it's like appreciating our shared humanity. It's just I think it opens up the possibilities for breakthroughs and innovation, to what you're saying. Yeah.
So is it ego and greed and competitiveness then that is holding us back? Because I mean, inclusivity just sounds like a win-win.
Is it ego and greed? What was the third word? Ego, greed, and
competitiveness.
Ego, greed, and competitiveness.
which are all derivatives of each other.
Yeah, and I think, I might take one step up, because I think if you think about ego, greed, and competitiveness, I think those are all based in fear. And so I think that that may be the common thread, that we are so fearful of being wrong. There's so much of like needing to be right, fearful of being wrong, fearful that your ego, that like maybe we will be exposed as not knowing something, as not being the expert in the room, of not having all the innovative ideas. So greed, we want to hold on to things for fear that other people are going to take something away from us. But I mean, really, there's so much out there. There's room for all of us. And I think if we can acknowledge that there is this fear, I'm a little bit afraid of things every day. There's something I'm afraid of, and yet just acknowledge the fear and move through it. I talk about in my book, there's a lot of discomfort in moving from traditional models of leadership to this more open, curious, inclusive leadership model, and that it will be uncomfortable. We'll have to face some of that discomfort and fear. And that's what makes us stronger. And that's what makes us better. So to your question, I do think that the ego and the greed and all of that competitiveness is caught up in fear. And if we could acknowledge the fear and still go forward, then we'll all be better off.
Time and time again, whenever I have conversations about innovation, what comes up is this idea of embracing failure.
Huge.
It may just be the common theme in every conversation about innovation, actually.
Well, there is no innovation without failure, right? I mean, what innovation ever succeeded on its first try?
Yeah. And with that said, maybe all of the resistance that we have experienced was necessary in order to be able to formulate the debate, the mind shift, to be more inclusive. I think that's something that I come up against a lot, is rather than regret what I've been through, the alienation, the imposter syndrome, that kind of thing, the self-doubt. It's almost been necessary in order to have the kind of motivation to speak out about this.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So with that, and also listening to you, and what it's probably all written in your book, is this idea of not just developing leaders, but also acknowledging that those who do feel underrepresented need to actually become leaders, perhaps even, having never considered themselves as leaders. It's maybe more on their shoulders to become leaders as a result of these experiences.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, that the leaders of today and tomorrow need to look very different than the ones in the past, and to have different experiences and different cultures and different backgrounds. So yes, we need to, and we also need to think differently about who's a potential leader, because as I said before, we typically it's been like the people most like us, but those are not necessarily the people we need to lead us to the future of work and this new age that we're in.
And then also to expect success to look different. Because I think if you're expecting the same success from the older style of leader, you're setting yourself up for a disappointment.
Yeah, I think we do need to look at success differently, and I think we need to talk much more openly about failure, because it's one of the things I've really noticed when working with clients, and especially on work on like innovation and psychological safety and embracing all the ideas, is that most of the clients I've worked with said that the hardest thing for them is speaking openly about failure, because it has been such a taboo. It has been such a taboo that if you admit to failure, you are going to lose your job, or you're going to lose your reputation, or there will be no more opportunities for you. And I think that's where leaders really set the tone, is that they have to say that if we're going to innovate, we have to expect failure, and we need to learn more quickly from our failures than in the past. So let's just have a method for talking about failure, just as we talk about success. And I think that's new for many, many people.
Mm. You've talked about vulnerability, and I've heard it personally as well. Maybe I have I'm a bit on guard to keep myself safe. I struggle to be vulnerable in front of others. But there's a certain side to your subject, which is a lack of education on how to be vulnerable, or, you know, talk about failure, or, you know, there's a whole kind of area of education on those kinds of topics. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you be vulnerable? I spent many years asking myself, how should I be vulnerable without actually, you know, putting myself in situations that are kind of dangerous?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important question, because I do believe there's a lot of misunderstanding around what it means to be vulnerable in the workplace. And I think so many people interpret it to mean I need to share deeply personal details of my life. And I think that's
I need to be able to cry in front of people.
right.
That's not being vulnerable.
Right.
That's something else.
Right. But I've seen people go to this extreme that actually makes people uncomfortable, which is like they just overshare. And that's not vulnerability. I think vulnerability is actually admitting that none of us are perfect, whether you're the CEO or you're the first line tech support person. And that the vulnerability is saying, I'm good at certain things and I'm not good at everything, and I could use some help here. And what am I missing? What am I not able to see because of my background? What can you contribute that I don't, even recognize? That's vulnerable to me, is saying, like, I don't know all and see all, but it's not like I need to share my deepest, darkest personal secrets. And I think that's where we often get confused about vulnerability.
Yeah, there needs to be a manual on that.
Maybe that's a new book, right? Exactly. What does it mean to be vulnerable?
Yeah,
because I've seen big failures of people who, like, I don't know if you remember this. It was maybe about a year ago. There was a guy on LinkedIn who was a CEO of a company and had to do big layoffs. And he got up on LinkedIn crying and saying how badly he felt about laying off his employees. And he thought that was vulnerable, but what it came out as just horribly tone deaf. Like, okay, you just let go all these people and you're crying on LinkedIn. That's not actually seen as like honest vulnerability. That just looks like, some kind of performance.
These are massive topics. Recently, someone sent me an article about how there are certain underrepresented people that just simply don't ask for help. And I'm in that group.
Yes, totally. I understand that. Yes.
I'm one of these people that absolutely will never ask for help, partly because I struggle to trust that anyone can help me. I've had to do many things alone, so I just kind of get on with it.
Yeah.
I trust myself. And so there's a whole load of maybe cultural, traditional conditionings of mine that make me default to, if I need to do something, I'll just do it myself kind of mentality. And so there really does need to be an education on these certain key topics, which I don't think we've even covered a fraction of them. Vulnerability one, we talked about empathy, just all these different kind of topics, which, no one's documented what they are. This is really unknown territory, I'm realizing.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's also a lot that's been written on it. I've met a lot of authors now writing about empathy, writing about inclusion, so I think the trick is, like, and that's what I tried to do, is my attempt in the Boldly Inclusive Leader, to try to bring as much of this together in one place as possible, to just, like, expose people to these ideas of what a new way of leading could look like. And, to your point about the fact that you never felt that you could actually be vulnerable, or that you could talk about failure or ask for help, you're not alone, because you had to constantly be proving yourself as a woman from an underrepresented group. So you've got the woman, you've got multiple intersecting areas of being other, right? You are not in the dominant majority. And therefore it's not surprising that you felt you couldn't do these things. And I think it's incumbent upon the leaders that perhaps you worked with and for to create the conditions where it might have been possible for you to ask for help. And so one of the things that I actually did probably in my last year in tech, that I thought this is something I now recommend that people do who are in leadership positions, is when you get your staff together, maybe for the first time, and do it regularly, is for everyone to share what they're great at. Like, what are my superpowers? So everyone around you knows Shini is fantastic at these things. And if I need help, I'm going to go to her. And then also, what are the things that I am not that great at and that I could use some help with? And if everyone can say those things out loud, we have a little bit of an inventory as a group. We know where our superpowers are and who needs help with various things, and we can collectively be stronger together. I think that's a really interesting exercise. When I did it with my team, I thought it was game changing, because we learned things about one another.
You are the first person I've spoken to, because you're right, there is a lot of material out there on inclusion, on leadership. I absolutely love Brené Brown's work.
Yes.
There's even, there's I was going to say Buddhism, philosophies on how to be more self-aware, meditation. There's a wealth of content out there, but you are the first person that I'm speaking to that applies that to the world of technology and engineering. And I feel like this industry is really lacking all of that, because somehow it degrades the technicality by talking about these topics. So thank you for being so bold to bring these two worlds together. It's so desperately needed. It's kind of obvious, but no one's been doing it. So I'm so glad that you're doing that.
I'm glad to be doing it too. And I will tell you, like, one of my tricks for when I do work with technical teams is that I'm certainly not an expert, but I have read a lot about the neuroscience behind all of the things I'm talking about. And there is neuroscience research to back up pretty much everything that I've shared with you. And so if I'm in front of a technical audience, I often reference some of these studies, because then you can get some credibility with the technical crowd, and then you can go deeper into the power skills, not the soft skills. But I think you're right that it haven't been valued and haven't been talked about maybe in this way regularly.
So then I would love to delve a bit deeper into this concept of psychological safety. I've been saving it till towards the end, because I came across it relatively recently, and I was blown away at this concept, because for underrepresented groups, feeling safe is everything to us. And I never even knew until I heard this term. I was like, that's what I've been lacking my whole career, is this sense of feeling safe where I can just be my whole self. Tell me more about this concept.
Yes, it is absolutely fundamental. It is the most foundational thing in building an inclusive culture. Like, you don't get an inclusive, innovative culture unless you have a foundation of psychological safety. And unfortunately, I think the term psychological safety has a little bit of a geeky or the fact that it has the word psychology in it turns some people off. But just to define it, it really means that in a group setting, you feel that you can ask a question, you can take a risk, you can make a mistake, you can challenge the status quo, and you know you're not going to be marginalized or excluded as a result of that. That's kind of the most basic definition of it.
But as someone who is underrepresented, has the term psychological safety hit home to me because I'm underrepresented, or does everyone need that psychological safety?
Everybody needs it. And I think it hit you so hard because it basically put a label on what you've been feeling a lack of your whole career. You have probably, as you're saying, you really didn't feel it ever, that you were totally safe to be yourself. And so I think it probably just had a deeply visceral impact when you understood what it was. Every single person needs to feel heard and seen and that they can speak up. And I think the issue why for you it was maybe such an aha moment is because you didn't have it, whereas people who I would say are in the dominant majority groups often have felt safe. Like they're, if you take someone who's always been the insider, like that executive that I was describing, he was in a fraternity, he was white, he was from the Ivy League, so he had all of that privilege and power that sort of comes along with it. He may have never felt unsafe. He may have always felt that he could show up as who he was and that his voice was welcome. And then you take someone like me. Now I am a white woman, so I have that level of privilege. And at the same time, I was one of, the only women in engineering at the leadership level. I was also one of the older people. So we all have our marginalizations, right? At the end of my career, I was one of the oldest people. So that made me feel different. I felt like I thought differently. And so I felt somewhat privileged and at the same time not always able to be myself and to speak up. So there are various levels. And I think what you're hitting on, Shini, is that the more marginal or maybe the more different that you feel, the farther you are away from what is the dominant group, probably by default, unless someone has made a huge effort to create a safe environment, you feel less safe to express yourself than others.
Well, Minette, it's been absolutely amazing to hear your wisdom on these topics. I definitely recommend reading your work. And I hope to put some links on how to get hold of your books for anyone who's interested in reading further. I mean, these are topics that are absolutely paramount, not just for personal evolution, but also innovation. And I hope that we can normalize these conversations. I hope our conversation has contributed to making these topics just more widely appreciated and understood. But for now, I walk away from this conversation really feeling like it's so important to accept oneself for who we are. And by doing that, we have a greater acceptance for others and their differences. And it's not just as a motivation to become a leader, but just to evolve in our own selves. I think life would just be better if we were kind and considerate to everyone and accepting of each other's differences. So thank you so much for bringing all of that up and so much more. It's been amazing to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation and I hope we'll stay connected.
Definitely. In fact, I really wish that I'd had you as a mentor through my career. I think that would have been an absolute game changer. So
thank you.
Hearing Minette talk about these really important topics has deeply resonated with me because so many of my own personal experiences now have a language and labels thanks to her. She has so much experience herself and has used so much of her professional experience and her own experiences as someone who's identifies as being in a minority to really construct terminology and awareness around the subject of inclusion. For me, what I really take away from this conversation is this idea of feeling safe and feeling appreciated, and the idea that we really need to embrace our full humanity. And in doing so, we automatically become leaders. What a powerful conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Innovators Making a Difference.